So essentially what you're describing is the reason for why these attacks are occurring, right? Palestinians are taking back what is theirs. But it's important to understand.
I think that's one of the reasons. I wouldn't say that's just the reason,
Yeah.
but that's one of them. Yeah.
Look, I agree. I agree that desperate people are going to do things like this, right? When you're living a life of despair for so many years, for so many generations, you become radicalized by that. Radical people do radical things. That's what we're seeing. So I think we're in agreement there. But on one hand, it's important to understand how we got here, but it's also important to understand what impact will actually occur from this. So Palestinians are not taking back what's theirs because this isn't going to result in Palestinians having more land and more freedom. It's going to result in the opposite. All Palestinian violence for the past 100+ years has resulted in worse conditions and less land for the Palestinians. It's been their primary approach for 100 years. And it hasn't resulted in anything good besides bloodshed, besides less freedom and less land, right? So we could, on one hand, identify what the motivation for this is, but that doesn't mean it's ineffective action. It's actually entirely counterproductive, and the cost, and the cost of life on Palestinians is going to be tremendous. They're going to have less freedoms. Some amount of Gazans get to come into Israel to work. That will no longer happen. Their lives won't be better. The situation in the West Bank will also be worse, right? So again, I hear you, and I sympathize with the Palestinians and their struggle, but their approach to that has always been to glorify violence and glorify the martyrs. Even now, right? We see in other conflicts when civilians are killed, the militants killing the civilians, they try to hide the crimes. But what we're seeing here, they're taking photos of them and cheering, and they're marching in the streets with dead civilians, right? So there's really a culture that glorifies violence. And again, cultures aren't created in vacuums, right? So it's important to understand how this culture was created. But we can also very clearly understand that in order to achieve peace, there needs to be a shift, and that shift needs to come from both sides. And violence has never worked for Palestinians, and I don't think it's going to start working now. So that's how I look at it.
The thing is, with that, you have to understand that Palestinians, they didn't start this violence that you're talking about. Like, Israel did start this. It's factually correct. They did. So for me, yes, Palestinians, for me, violence isn't the answer. It should never be the answer. But for me, just sometimes, maybe violence has to be used to get back what's yours, to get back your rights, to protect your people.
So we could talk about the history. I would say that there's a strong case to be made that this conflict was started by Israel or by the early Zionists who, returned after thousands of years to a land that was occupied, that was inhabited by other people, and wanted to turn it into a Jewish homeland. It's not hard to understand why Palestinians would reject that. It's not hard to understand that at all. But and there were Palestinians who were displaced by early Zionists, right? What happened was early Zionists bought the land. They bought it legally. It doesn't mean it's moral, but they bought the land, and then some Palestinians were displaced. Palestinians didn't like the fact that they were being displaced, and they didn't like the fact that Jews were here trying to create a Jewish homeland. But the first act of physical violence actually came from the Palestinians as a result of the Zionist attempt to create a Jewish homeland, and that was the Hebron massacre in 1929, where hundreds of Jews were killed in Hebron. My family actually lived there at the time. So, it's not as straightforward where the violence started. It's true that prior to the Zionist movement, there wasn't nearly as much violence, but the Jews living here under Islamic rule were second-class citizens, right? It's not like we lived here as equal partners. So you could see why there was a motivation for Jews who were persecuted in Europe to try to create a homeland of their own, and why they didn't feel good about living under Arab rule because they were seen as second-class citizens. So it's a little bit more nuanced than pointing fingers who started it. And I also don't think it's entirely productive because we could talk all day about who's at fault. I think we lost our friend. Anyways, thanks for joining us. but to finish that thought, we could talk all day about who's at fault, but that doesn't really help us reach a solution. At the end of the day, if we want to reach a solution, we both need to take responsibility. We both need to come together towards common ground, learn the narrative of the other, accept that there's a legitimacy to the narrative of the other, and work to build a unified narrative, a path towards peace and reconciliation. That's really the approach. I see we have a fair bit of comments here on YouTube. I'm going to start addressing them. Thanks to everybody tuning in. Justin, you want to join the live stream? I see you here in the chat. I'd love to have a Palestinian voice come on if you're interested. You're asking what is the alternative, or are you asking what's the alternative to violence? I've always said that Palestinians have done a great job turning their cause to be an internationally recognized cause. And if that cause had more of the ethos of, let's say, someone like Martin Luther King, one of nonviolence, I think they would have been far more effective. I think we've seen people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi defeat powers much more powerful than themselves through nonviolence. And when you're dealing with a population that still has the trauma of the Holocaust and hundreds of years of persecution in their blood, if you think that violence is going to work well on them, you're mistaken. I think this has been a major flaw to think that violence will work against Jews who built the land of Israel under the notion of never again will we be genocided like that. So attempts to genocide the Jews are just not going to land well. And I think we've seen that. The violence has not brought us closer to peaceful resolution. It's only brought us farther away. So massive peaceful revolution amongst Palestinians, I think, would have gotten us much further. Bill Johns asks, would a one-state solution be the answer? I think that the amount of fear and hate our populations have of one another, a one-state solution currently would be a disaster. If you look at the demographics on the land, it's around 50% Israeli, 50% Palestinian. They would be competing over governmental control. Populations that are culturally different, who don't speak the same language, who are traumatized by one another, and have a tremendous amount of fear and hate of one another. That's not a recipe for success. It's likely to lead to civil war, which we may cause more bloodshed than we've seen up until now. So I don't think a one-state solution would work in the short term. I think we could get there within a few generations. I think if we do want to talk in terms of one state, it would need to be a federation. So think kind of how the United States has many states in one country, or how Switzerland has many cantons. I think if you distribute the land and give communities more local control and have a distributed system like of checks and balances, and maybe like one unified government, an Israeli government, and a Palestinian government, I think that could potentially work, but not like a binational state democracy the way many describe it. It would need to be a little bit more sophisticated. And I think there's almost just as many problems with the two-state solution. So it's not like there's a clear solution here. Reading more comments. Please provide updates as you're getting them. It's hard for me to follow multiple threads. So Pittsburgh Dude 87 goes, Palestinian self-defense might make Israel think twice about continuing to infringe on their rights. It's too early to see what the outcome of all this will be. History tells us that is not the case. Palestinian self-defense or Palestinian violence, however you want to describe it, is not new. It's been the primary form of resistance from day one, and time again, we've seen that it has not caused progress, not to peace, and it has not made the lives of Palestinians better. A lot of the policies that Israel has implemented, which have made the lives of Palestinians hard, is under the pretenses of security against violence, right? So I think if we look at the history, I don't think your analysis will come to fruition the way you think it will.